values and it comes under the guise of, our fraternity is so great, or we're experiencing this fraternity or whatnot. How does that kind of work with what Crowley is telling us in Magic Without Tears, which frankly is very down on group activity in general? And I think this is kind of the elephant in that particular book that's sitting in the living room that no one really wants to talk about, because he's not very enthusiastic about group work at all at that point.
No, he criticizes it and says, you get people together and they start criticizing their hats. And,
right. And they
become petty and they don't actually concentrate on the work.
Right. He also claims that they sink to the lowest common denominator, that no matter how elevated the group is, it sinks to the level of the lowest person there. And I look at this and I'm like, well, okay, how do we rectify that with the current, interest in group activities and group workings and so on? And I don't know. I mean, to me, it seems like the OTO is slipping backwards, via its needs for its herd values into a sort of, old Aeonic, the group comes first, and, put your critical thinking aside and support what the group wants, and sacrifice the individual on behalf of the group. And again, Crowley is telling us in Magic Without Tears, hey, selfishness is the way it's at. You want to be selfish. Selfishness is not a bad thing. And so I ask people, as a selfish individual, what are you getting out of X, Y, or Z event? And if, as a selfish individual, you're getting a lot out of it, that's great. Don't let us rain on your parade. Have a good time. But if you're sitting there not really getting too much out of it and thinking that it's lame and it's not really doing what you think it's supposed to do, then don't feel obligated to continue to support it or feel that you have to turn off your critical thinking skills if it's got some problems. And again, I kind of feel that dispassionate sort of attitude. I mean, I keep coming back to this thing where in Astarte where he talks about self-mutilation. And I kind of feel that people in the OTO have mutilated their critical thinking skills and their judgment in order to pursue this sort of half-assed Astarte of Thelema as a religion, where they can't really think about it critically anymore because they've mutilated their ability to do that. And that's really, if that's true, that's really sad. But when you see the great reluctance and fear people have to voice what they really think, what other conclusion can you really come to?
Right, or what's worse is they become hypocrites and say one thing publicly and another thing privately.
Yeah, we see this all the time, and it's very sad. And it's again. The more people get away from the Crowley material, I think, and the more they start adopting conventional values and attitudes, the more this sort of thing comes into play. And again, I think in a lot of ways, worshiping Crowley is safer than trying to emulate him or study him. If you worship him, you kind of keep him at a distance. And that sort of intense passion people feel for their leaders, a lot of times I think happens because they see the leader sort of protecting them from Crowley. If you have a leader in the OTO who's an authority who seems, like a nicer guy and a better person and less threatening than Crowley is, then you're going to love that person and see him as a protector almost, protecting you from the scary and dangerous, transgressive and unhappy making things in the Crowley corpus. On the other hand, if you have somebody who's telling you, no, you've got to get over your fears and really confront the things that are bothering you the most in the material and make a commitment to it despite the fact that it seems really scary a lot of the time, and that's too bad, then that person becomes a threat too. So, I sympathize with people that feel that way occasionally, but, it seems to get sillier and sillier the more we look at what they're really doing.
Well, something you just said is really interesting, because when you're saying, the worship of Crowley, it's almost as if they're setting up this Neoplatonic duality in which Crowley is kind of like the form or the perfect, and they feel that they never can actually reach that level, and so they put him up on this kind of pedestal and actually kind of deify him. And that just seems to me the antithesis of what Thelema is all about. Crowley, maybe he did say, I am Thelema, but that doesn't mean that, he was unattainable or that he is the end-all be-all of Thelema.
Well, what you're seeing, too, is an influence, I think, of a certain current within the Thelema community, which I think is pernicious. I think it's very dangerous, but it sort of sets up a problem for people where they cling so much to orthodoxy that we're the orthodox AA or we're the orthodox OTO and we're the ones that are right and we're the ones that are following what Crowley really wanted. And if they produce material that is cognate and consistent with Crowley, it's completely boring. It's redundant because he already did it, and there doesn't need to be any new material that's just going to confirm it because that's boring and not interesting. So they don't really produce much work. On the other hand, if they produce something original or something different or something that goes, beyond what Crowley did or in some, different way, then they are heretics and, challenging the orthodox way of looking at things, and that's bad too. So they've kind of, they've worked themselves into a corner where they can't really replicate Crowley's stuff. They can't really replicate Crowley's stuff because that's redundant, and they can't do anything new because that's heretical. And that current tends to exist on a very elevated plane among certain, so-called adepts, and it trickles down to the hoi polloi in the OTO who are not, very advanced magically, but who nonetheless imitate that either indirectly or because of an occult current or however you want to look at it. But that's kind of the problem that they've got themselves worked into. And to a certain extent, I sympathize with their plight because on the one hand, you have people who are out there saying that they are doing all of this original magical work. And when you look at it, it's puerile trash that is instantly forgettable. I mean, I encourage people to go back to the 70s and 80s and look at all the groundbreaking, wonderful, amazing magical work that was being done in like 1985. And it's absolute nonsense now, and no one cares about it, and no one pays any attention to it. And no thoughtful, really deep person thinks that it's very important at all. So the people making these claims about surpassing Crowley and coming up with this new and original work are often really, really lame, and we should be critical of their claims. At the same time, unless you're really trying to do the material and really confront it as an individual, you're stuck in this worshiping Crowley mode, which, I can live my normal life and worship Crowley, and I can get the benefit of being a Thelemite and not take any of the real risks from it, which I also think is a major selling point of the Thelema as a religion thing. It doesn't seem very risky to me. It seems like converting Thelema into something that, average middle-class contented people are going to find acceptable and, a nice little slot in their lives. I mean, one of the questions that I've looked at recently too is if Thelema isn't a religion, what is it? And one of the things that occurs to me is it an ideology? And if you look up the dictionary definition of an ideology, I think Thelema fits that definition more than it does a religion. And, Crowley wasn't telling people not to call it an ideology. Maybe he wasn't really familiar with that term. It didn't have the same kind of use then that it does now. And I have friends who argue with me about the use of the term ideology in this context too. But to me, an ideology is much more threatening than a religion, because the ideology of the West that we all live and work with basically says there's a place for religion in your life. It can't get out of that place, and it shouldn't, try to take over your life, but there's a place for religion in your life. And so the people in the OTO sort of, to me, are often making a deal with the larger ideology of the West, which is we accept your values, we accept your way of looking at the world, we accept your claims. This is our religion, and we're making a case for it to be slotted into the same place that other people slot their religions. Okay? Is that okay? And here's why we're legitimate, and here's why we're non-threatening, and here's why we're not going to be a problem. So we just want a place at the table with the other religions. We don't really want any more than that. And I kind of think that's not really what Crowley wanted. Crowley did not want Thelema to be accepted as, any other religion. I think he wanted a lot more than that for it. And I don't know if the current people in the OTO are ready to even look at that kind of question, or whether they're up for it to be anything more than a religion when they can't even do the religion thing very well.
Well, I think that's a good place for us to stop. Thanks again for being on the podcast, and lots of people have been asking about where the podcast is, when this the next one coming out, and in particular, a number of the emailers have stressed that they want to make sure that you're continuing on the podcast. So thanks for being on the newest one.
Well, thanks for having me, John.
93.
Thanks again to Keith for being on the show once more. Golden Hoard Publishing has released a significant number of fascinating books over the last few years. As they do, I've been quick to promote them. The first, The Practical Angel Magic of John D. Zanukian's Tables, was mentioned on one of the first shows. The second book in the Source Works of Ceremonial Magic series, The Keys to the Gateway of Magic, was co-authored by Stephen Skinner, and he came on the show to tell us about the book. Similarly, with the release of their third book in the series, The Goetia of Dr. Rudd, co-author David Rankine has now come on the show to tell us about it and share his ideas about the Goetia. Subjects like Enochian and Goetic magic seem to be very popular with Thelema Coast to Coast listeners, so I'm hopeful that you all will listen to the interview, and if you're really interested in it or practice Goetic magic, that you'll get this book. I cannot emphasize how important it is for this material to be supported. Anyway, enough of my banter. Let's get into the interview. Here's David Rankine.
We have on the phone with us David Rankine. Welcome to the podcast, David. 93.
93, John.
For those who aren't aware, you and Stephen Skinner are the owners of and produce most of the books from Golden Hoard Press. And you've recently come out with, I think it's your fourth book, The Goetia of Dr. Rudd.
Yep, The Goetia of Dr. Rudd's the third one in the Sourceworks of Ceremonial Magic series.
Right.
I mean, there are a few other books on Golden Hoard, like Stephen's Complete Magician's Tables, and some rare sort of Feng Shui manuscripts he's working on as well, but the Sourceworks is the two of us together, yeah.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Now, people are usually familiar with the Goetia from, I guess, the Lesser Key that was published by Crowley, from the work that Mathers did, and maybe some other authors here and there, also from some of the work that is being done by Ouroboros Press. They're putting out various manuscripts. So there seems to be an interest in the Goetia. Why was it that you decided to put out the Goetia of Dr. Rudd?
Well, Joseph Peterson did an excellent job with his book. Obviously, his work can't be praised enough. I have a great deal of admiration and respect for what he does, but we felt that Rudd's Goetia was quite unique and deserved to be put out in its full glory. Rudd had sort of turned up as a name again and again in our research when we were looking through various manuscripts for the other earlier books in the series, and indeed the second book, Keys to the Gateway of Magic, is Rudd material. And we just felt that the uniqueness of Rudd's Goetia with the extra elements that it brought which haven't been put into the public arena before meant it deserved to be put out there so people could sort of see what extra additions he put in and what benefits there are to working it with those additions in it.
Now, that's one of the things that is important about this book, is it's publishing a lot of manuscript material that has never been published before and or compiled together in a complete volume.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, obviously the most noticeable thing is that Rudd paired off the 72 demons in the first part in the Goetia with the controlling Shemham 4 Archangels. Not a new idea. We see it back in the Testament of Solomon in sort of 1st to 3rd century CE. So there are a lot of precedents there for that happening. But it was something that I for years had thought about. I've no other writers and magicians have also postulated it. I mean, Poke Runyon is a good example of he came up with the idea as well. But finding the sort of precedent of it actually being in a manuscript and the dual seals to be put on either side of the Laman with the demon on one side and the controlling angel on the other was just quite a revelation and a pleasure. And that is obviously one of the most attractive things about Rudd's Goetia, that you have this whole pairing and the whole controlling force there, which makes it easier to work with the demons when they're called up.
Now, one of the criticisms against Rudd's manuscript is the inclusion from the Heptameron.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that people should criticize that, because both the Lesser and the Greater Key of Solomon are largely derivative from the Heptameron, as are many of the other grimoires. What Rudd did is basically acknowledge that fact and put more of the information in a more lucid way. I mean, for example, there's more information on the magic circle in Rudd's Goetia than in the other ones. So I don't think it can really be criticized when the Heptameron is clearly one of the roots of the Goetia.
Now, your
kind of framing this whole book in the Goetia and all of the various manuscripts in it, kind of looking at it in the lens of the Lemegeton and saying, okay, this is kind of like the full work, the 5 books, and then looking at the various manuscripts and the pieces of